Welcome to Africa Lenazi. Today marks the day in which the case of James Somerset versus Charles Stewart was decided in court in the King's Bench, and James Somerset, the African slave, was set free. It was a big deal in England on that day. So that's what today's story is about. Today is exactly 249 years ago where a courageous African man escaped from his captive or his kidnapper. It was on Monday, the 22nd of June, 1772, where the court case of James Somerset, the African man, versus his captive, Charles Stewart, a Scotsman, was decided in England's King's Court. James Somerset, the African man, could have been called Kwaku, Ajite, Ibrahim, Ikechukwu, you name it. But as we all know, once kidnapped and sold into slavery, every effort was made to erase the memory of the enslaved in order for him to forget his or her African roots. James Somerset was born around 1741, so it's said, and was abducted and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean around 1749 to the 13th colony, now called America. Upon arriving in America, probably during a slave auction or right at the port, a customs officer spotted him and liked him and felt he can make some money. A customs officer by the name of Charles Stewart purchased James Somerset. On balance, it appeared James Somerset was clever, most likely literate, but not much is said about that. Charles Stewart, on his return trip to England, was accompanied by his new slave. So he went on a business trip, and on his return, he came back with a bounty, a slave. He felt really good about himself. James Somerset accompanied Charles Stewart to England in 1768 or 1769, around 1768, 1769. The sea journey to England gave James Somerset enough time to think about how he can plan his escape, because he must have been told slavery was forbidden in Europe or in Britain or in England at that time. He must have had it in the back of his mind. Although there is sometimes a misinformation that the slaves were just passive, this is probably another example of passive aggressiveness, where the slave was constantly planning on his best way of escape from bondage. But it was extremely difficult. If they escape the master's field, they're likely going to be caught. If they go to the Caribbean, slavery was happening over there. If they go to South America, slavery was practiced there. There was nowhere to run. Africa was being decimated as well by a lot of wars, a lot of conquest, which brought about a lot of chaos. So there was very little chances for escape. This also proves that most of the time, due to information being passed around, the slaves were fully aware of the political climate, the economic situation, social economic classes, because a lot of them worked in some of the houses, some of the aristocratic houses. They were fully aware of technological advancements, new technologies coming in, which can help them sort of disguise themselves in order to be able to escape. They were fully aware of the legal so-called rules or legal changes that came in that could work in their favor. And of course, fully aware of the environmental changes as well as the environmental laws that come in. Upon James's arrival in England with Charles Stewart, news traveled fast within the Black and African community as well as the city of London, just as today's news travels fast using Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. James Somerset must have witnessed Africans in the city of London who were free of bondage, going about their daily business, and he certainly must have made friends who gave him good consultative advice as he lived in London. On Sunday, the 10th of February 1771, James Stewart was baptized at the St. Andrew's Church in Holborn, in London. Many Africans today, or many people today, use St. Andrew's Church in London without realizing the significance of James Somerset and how his bravery laid the foundation for which some of us enjoy today. Right after the baptism, James Somerset escaped from the talons of Charles Stewart. James Somerset escaped because he knew, or he had inkling, that he was about to be shipped off to Jamaica to be sold onto the plantation. He wasn't prepared to go through that. Charles Stewart had already counted his pennies or hedged his profits as to how much he was going to make once he sold James. So he was extremely livid when he discovered James had escaped. Charles Stewart swiftly sent out a mob to go and find his property. Charles Stewart colluded with the police at the time to locate James Somerset at once. This is indicative proof that the enslaved captives resisted their captors by highlighting such injustices such as Black Lives Matter demonstrations today try to do. James Somerset's escape also raised a lot of eyebrows and brought a lot of attention to the issue of slavery, coercing the elites of the country to have the uncomfortable debate about the act of slavery. James Somerset was eventually captured and imprisoned on the ship Anne and Mary, apparently under the captain John Knowles, bound for Jamaica. Once news got out that James Somerset had been captured and imprisoned on the ship bound for Jamaica, his godparents on 3rd December 1771 applied to the court for a writ or summons of habeas corpus for the judge or the court to determine the lawfulness of his detainment or arrest. And habeas corpus meant the individual who had been detained or arrested must be brought into court, must be presented in court, must be presented to the judge for the judge to determine whether his arrest or detainment was lawful or not. It seems the stars on that day were aligned for James Somerset because his godparents, John Marlowe, Thomas Wilkins, and Elizabeth Cade, their writ application to the court was accepted, where Lord Mansfield ordered a hearing for the 21st of January 1772. This was a groundbreaking and a high-profile case, and every ambitious barrister or lawyer was interested in this case. James Somerset had 5 famous barristers presenting him, arguing his case, while Charles Stewart, the defense team, had 2 barristers. The prosecuting team, casting aside all the inhumane practices affiliated with slavery and the slave trade, focused specifically on the law, factual legal case rather than the emotion. For instance, they argued, and I quote, "English law or English contract law does not allow for any persons to enslave himself or could contract be binding without the person's consent." Think about that for a minute. The argument continued. The English common law and any statutory law made by the Parliament recognized the existence of slavery was unlawful. The defense team's rebuttal was, property must be protected and it would be dangerous to free all the blacks or Africans in England. That was the prosecution's argument. Arguments went back and forth, back and forth. Eventually, on the 22nd of June 1772, the verdict was out. The judge, or the then judge, Lord Mansfield, as expected, did not mince his words. And I quote, "A foreigner could not be imprisoned here on the authority of any law existing in his own country. The power of a master over his servant is different in all countries, more or less limited or extensive. The exercise of it, therefore, must always be regulated by the laws of the place where exercised." Lord Mansfield set James Somerset free, also relying on a 1679 statute that established that slaves fell within the category of servants and not chattels. Therefore, the man must be discharged. On this day, 22nd of June, 1772, was a glorious day for a lot of the Africans living in Britain who were there just on transit across the Atlantic to be sold into slavery. Although it was a glorious day, Africans still experienced unrest, being captured. There was still the risk of them being captured on the streets of London and put aboard ships and sent across the Atlantic to be sold onto the plantation. This was a groundbreaking day for all black people in Britain in 1772. You can imagine the news went viral at that time. Apparently, Benjamin Franklin, who became one of the US presidents, was in England at that time. He's said to have bleated, "How can Britain say slavery was abolished in Britain when its colonies were still practicing slavery? But yet, he didn't see to it that slavery was abolished when he came into power." I brought this story to you because today is a very important day for black people in Britain. Today was when Lord Mansfield made it quite clear slavery in Britain was unlawful. You can imagine how the news went down in England in those days. Today marks 249 years since that case. And Africans are still experiencing discrimination today on the streets of London every now and then. Let's take this moment to take it in and enjoy the foundations which James Somerset, this African man, has laid for us to enjoy today. Until next time, don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and to comment, and to press the notification bell for new videos for us to keep the channel going. Until then, bye.